Welcome to Zeros and Ones, a podcast about philosophy, ancient wisdom, and the meaning of life. Here is your host, Becca Thompson. So, I'll say welcome to our podcast, all the millions of people that are listening. And I have my first official guest, and it is my father, who did what we like to call in our family a drop-in pop-in this morning, and woke me up and said good morning to me. And so here we are sharing our coffee. Thank you, Dad.
Good morning.
And so...
Right, there's my cup.
Yes. So
it's important to see where it is.
I thought I had said, it might be fun is since you're here, let's do a podcast. And we were talking about ethics, and I was talking about just the roots of that word and how we each have a personal ethic. And I know that my dad has ideas about what I had been describing as a global ethic, which is the idea that we each have our own, this is my logic, we have our own thoughts about what is right to do in the world. And that we seek people who align with those thoughts, and then but at the end of the day, it's all still individual. And then as you build out, that's what becomes what I had defined as a global ethic. And then in something like the presidential race or in wars or whatever, it's the evidence that we don't all keep the same ethic. That was my logic behind, but I was all just talking by myself because that's based on my book, which I am done writing and publishing soon, called One, the Biography of All Things, which I've been telling you about, Dad. So I'm curious, first question, how would you define ethics? How would you define ethic? I know, it's a big question. Here, I'm going to point this more toward you.
Is how you judge yourself in the world and how you want to leave a legacy of that ethic for others either to follow or cringe and run away from. And so like Hitler had an ethic that was, he didn't want to waste time with anyone else's ethic but his own. And that was that, we don't need to talk about Hitler.
Well, and why not jump in the deep end?
Well, he obviously was a man possessed by evil and left that ethic behind, and it still lives with people that think that he was somehow above everybody else and that his ethic was to be admired. But I'm not a Nazi expert or anything. We could talk about the ethics of medicine, or we could talk about the...
Well, first of all, Hitler is an interesting point because in many ways, he's obviously an incredibly polarizing, energizing figure to pretty much everybody on the globe. But what's fascinating, sometimes I think to myself, is if the man didn't kill himself, how much different our world might be, because I think people who would have wanted answers would have gotten. You know what I mean? I just find that fascinating. But so you mentioned medicine, and I'm going to point this out to my audience of millions, that a week ago this morning, I was with my father in the ER, almost at this exact moment, as he had gone in from throwing up blood, and then he was checked into the ICU, and we thought, oh boy, because my father has had, how many aneurysms surgeries have you had, Dad?
Well, it's about 11 procedures, and each one of them had a lethality to it that would have left me 6 feet under or in a coffee can. But I just found out there's a new way that you can go about it. It's called natural organic. The last one starts with an R, but it's composting.
Composting
body
yourself?
Composting.
Oh,
You're put
the
in.
new rage for death.
It's a new. Well, that way you can bury yourself in more than one place. I mean, I couldn't do it, but others could. But you're put in a box of shavings of wood or whatever, and then rolled every few days or so, and in 6 weeks, you've got compost pa.
Well, you know what? That's actually in my book.
Is it?
It's not necessarily compost pa, but about that we are that whole. It's biblical that you came from dust and from dust you'll return.
Right,
But when you
absolutely.
think about it too, we are in when we eat hopefully even the best diets. You're eating something that you're killing, right? If it's an apple off of a tree, you're ending its life, or if it's fallen from the tree, it is in essence in its later stages of its own death because it fell from the tree, and then you eat it from the ground if that's the case. But then there's just so much in it. Everything that we eat that's good for us grew in soil of things that were nutrient
Yeah.
rich, which is dead. The nutrients are means that
Those
something
that
died.
went,
Yeah,
something that went before.
yeah, yeah.
And whether it's the crow that's eating the Native American up on a stand high up in the air that then poops out the portions that it didn't consume, and then eventually dies, and then it falls to the ground and gets composted. Yeah, it is from dust to dust, and that way we could have part of me up at Honey Rock and part of
I'll
me.
have to remember compost pa. I have a feeling that whatever we record right now, somewhere, someday, not that I know if I'm gonna outlive you, but someone's gonna listen to this and they're gonna think, oh man, those two. Rebecca's just like her father.
Well, I saw it in the paper yesterday,
Interesting.
and in the editorial side I think it was the editorial side that it was just passed in Minnesota. They're one of 11 states that are allowing that to be considered. It isn't ready yet, so I have to hold off for a few
So
years.
don't die yet. Well, you made it another week.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was actually more coughing up blood. And it just started. I was lying there in bed, and suddenly I did a gurgle, and I coughed, and I thought, well, didn't taste bad, and so I just swallowed it. And then when I sat up, though, and leaned forward, I had
You felt
blood
it.
dripping out of my nose, and it wasn't a nosebleed, though, because I coughed it out of my lungs. So worst came to worst, and I didn't want to spew out all my blood in the bedroom and have that to clean up, so I figured I better go to the hospital.
That's
an ethic.
Thank you. It is. That. So then that leads us back to ethics. I just wanted to establish that you were just a week ago there, and it was not like I joked last week with people. Someone said your dad has 9 lives. I said no, he has more lives than a herd of cats. But there's
It's by the grace of God that I'm here. That's for sure.
well, right, and that brings up a great point of like how do you navigate when you're talking about ethics in terms of like micro moments of what things are supposed to look like. Like nobody knows. I did say last week when you were in the hospital, I said no to my sister, who of course is an MD as well. I said no 2 births are alike. I said, Angie, you know this better than I do. No 2 births are alike, and no 2 deaths. I mean, I said you and Dad know this way better than I do, but I'm recognizing like there's no manual for how this works. Like you have no idea. You don't know when a baby's going to come, and you also don't know when someone's going to pass away. And a colleague of mine lost their parent just a couple weeks ago, and it was almost, I mean, I've seen so many people, and I hate to be rude, although it is emotionally very tumultuous, that I'm always just like, I'm really sorry that for you the person passed away, but my dad has come to the brink about a dozen times, and then here he is in our podcast. So cheers to that.
Well,
Yeah. So that's when I went to Amsterdam. That's where that mug's from.
oh, okay.
So so let's talk about medical ethics, and then you can tell me your big idea about national service. So what as a doctor, what has always been the way that you would navigate stuff? Because I'm sure it's very challenging well, first, each patient is different, but I mean, is there an instance in your mind that can come up that was really like this? I didn't know what to do and what was right. Whether it's telling the family to do something or telling the patient to do something, or was it always very black and white and clear?
Well, it's rarely very black and white and clear. So there are nuances that are encountered every day. And being in family practice, it's the most challenging and most delightful and most variable experience of each day that you could ever hope to imagine. And I've run across some amazing people, and the ethics of their lives is really quite varied. I had a patient, and I consider anybody that I see a potential friend, and rarely have I created enemies. Although the publisher for the first book that I wrote on miracles was treated so poorly by me, he was left in the room for over an hour at the end of the day when we were all ready to close down
and
go home. But I didn't realize that he was there, and he was hearing us talking and laughing. And finally he came out of the room and said, "I've never been so rudely treated in my life." And he stomped out, and I chased after him, and he wouldn't hear of it of coming back in. And so the ethics was, I called my old partner who had been the doc for this guy for years, and he called up the guy and said, "I'm really not that bad," and it was a problem with the staffing, and the chart was taken off his door, and the door was shut. So anyhow, we patched it up, but treating people as individuals, and every one of them is a unique individual, is created for a purpose in life, and to help them find what that is, and to help them get rid of that which is in their way for going forward. Yeah. And I figured I needed to apply that to myself too, as far as with all the things that I discovered of my own corpus delicti, that much more vulnerable than I ever wished to be, and that I discovered late on a Friday night that I was covering the ER for the weekend, that I had an aneurysm that was about to burst. And I finished out the weekend and then had the surgery, and that was 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so used to that story, but we can share that with my millions of podcast listeners that we're creating that. Well, you created out, like, there's the property of Honey Rock. You always wanted that. Sometimes when I'm up there, I think my dad just built this out of his mind. He wanted it, and then now here we are. So why don't you tell that story about self-discovering your first aneurysm?
Well,
first of all, actually, we might even need to describe what an aneurysm is. I don't know that everybody knows what that is.
Probably not. An aneurysm is an enlargement of the arteries, which are the vessels that are carrying the oxygenated blood from the heart to the body in all its various parts. It's amazing. Our body is so incredibly complex, and it's beyond comprehension. And just talking about the human body, you could go on, or I could go on for weeks and years and not really copy the same text in the future, from embryologic development to death, all the things that go on with the body. But anyhow, aneurysm is an enlargement of that artery that makes it, it's like a balloon. If you've blown it up too many times and too far, it reaches a point where, these long, narrow balloons that are pretty tough to get started, but then when you behind, they do expand. And then if you let go, they'll go back almost to the same size as they were originally, but it's easier the second time, and the third and the fourth and the fifth and the 100th time. And somewhere along the line, finally the balloon gives out and says, "All right, I'm going to pop." Oops, now I'm getting your call.
It's funny, I can hear it because I've got the shotgun mic.
And I think I
actually heard a truck going past. I'll have to edit that. Isn't that funny?
I think it's probably my wife that I haven't told her that
it's probably my mother calling. Is it, Mom?
Well, anyhow, where were we?
Yeah, you were telling about finding your own aneurysm. Thank you for getting us right back on track.
Balloons out enough times, it finally reaches the point that it's going to pop. And unlike a balloon, which is just one layer of something expandable, the artery is 3 layers of material that will stretch and squeeze back down between every heartbeat, so that the highs and lows of blood pressure is lessened, so that the pulse pressure, as it's called, is very low in children because they're so elastic that their arteries will expand and go back down where blood flows, but it doesn't really have to push or be pushed along because it squeezes back down, just like that balloon in the early stages of its stretching is squeezing against the pressure, and with the human body, it can go downstream, and whereas in a balloon, it gets to the end of the balloon, and then that's where it stops. So the aneurysm is a portion of that artery that stretches and expands, but not the whole thing. And it's kind of like if you were to put some bread dough in your palm of your hand and then squeeze down, it would come out between the fingers. And that's where one of those spaces in my abdomen popped out like that. And then it reached the point that it decided to pop through 2 of the 3 membranes to get out to the large cavernous peritoneal cavity, and all my blood could go into there and I'd be dead, and with no sign of the cause of death, which may have been what happened to my brother that was found dead on the floor. No sign of blood or anything, but every one of my brothers has had aneurysms with no family history, so it's really odd. But so that aneurysm can be corrected by putting a stent in there nowadays, but back 20 years ago, you had to go inside and put in another piece of tubing, kind of like either a sewer line that's leaked out or as the balloon that's blown out that you have to cut through to get down to where you can stop that from happening.
It's interesting you say that, because actually 2 years ago, and it's still a problem of roots in my water line, essentially my sewer line, right? That they came in and they said exactly that. Well, the clay is cracking, because it's 100 years old under the ground there, and we can roll out a
That's right.
tube in there, and then we'll blow it up, and then it'll be the inside liner, and that's essentially what's happened. So you found your own aneurysm, though, right? Because you were doing an ultrasound machine and instructing others how to find it, and I want to tell the story for you.
Well, I was all alone. It was 11:30 at night, and I was supposed to cover another.
And you're at the ER, right?
60 hours in the ER, which in a small town, you're the only doc in town then, and any kind of mayhem can happen, or a mistake, or mischief.
Yeah.
And that's the rest of the.
You've got lots of stories, I know.
Yeah, and so with that interruption of my wife Patty calling, reminding me that the day ticks on, and I do need to get back so I don't tick everybody off. I will have to leave some of the nitty gritty in the future, but it was it's a situation where once you've demonstrated it that you can blow one area out, you can blow out another area. And I found ways to blow out virtually every area I've got, and to avoid the extreme, which would have been the aneurysm, as I was told by the cardiovascular surgeon that kept me alive and stitched up the one that happened in my chest 10 years later than the first aneurysm. He had 2 of his patients that they could not be further operated on, and they blew out their aneurysm, but it had eroded through the chest wall, and it was pretty grisly. It was like the Aliens movie of the 1980s, and there was blood everywhere. And the ethics of that, for me, was I didn't want that to be the situation for my family to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
So I had that surgery done
So
in 2015.
You found your first aneurysm at the hospital in Grantsburg, Wisconsin, using the ultrasound machine.
The specifics.
Okay, fine. That's fine. And it was you found whatever. You
Right.
found your own aneurysm.
Yeah.
And then you found, and that was in 2004.
2004, and had surgery
And then,
in January.
yes, I know, because I was in the ICU with you. And then you had then you had another one in your iliac. No, then which is the
iliac,
descending.
yeah. That's the.
We're getting way off. We're into this is now aneurysm talk. Scandals and animals.
Aneurysm too.
And then you had the one that did
The
dissect
iliac,
in your chest.
Well, the one in my abdomen, the first one had dissected and then gone back in again. So it was within a.
But you've had how many? You've had 1, 2, 3, and then you had in 2021 you had the surgery.
I had about 15
and then
was the big one that blew out.
15 was the big one. I know, and then you had one last. With every increasing surgery, I just want everybody to know my father becomes more and more of a medical mystery of how he survives them. And in fact, first of all, he had the best surgeon at a level 1 trauma center here in Minneapolis. And then he had the best surgeon, the only surgeon willing to take his case in all of the Twin Cities. And then there was left to one doctor in the entire country who was willing to take his most recent surgery down in Houston, Texas, that he survived. And so it amps it up. And so that's why when my father knocked on my door this morning, I thought it was funny. And I said, let's just do a podcast. Even though my mother interrupted us. It's special guest with eggs and scrambled eggs.
And the fact that I could walk over here is part of that process that usually the aneurysm that erupted in my chest that put me to the ground in an instant, and I remember none of that, feeds the spinal cord, and the spinal cord controls your legs.
Well, yeah. That's another. The fact that you can walk at all after all these procedures is pretty incredible.
That first, or that surgery, which wasn't the first, which was the third, and with a cracked chest, to get at that one, by the grace of God, my anatomy was such that I had enough of the alternative blood supply arteries, much smaller though they are still able to feed the spinal cord. So I was able to wiggle my toes and walk, albeit much more slowly. And my last day of running was January 10th, 2005, and I'd run 5 miles and feel nothing of doing it. And now if I walk 500 feet, I'm feeling it as a challenge. So
I'm sorry.
So anyhow, but there's a lot more to that, but that's aneurysm surgery.
Well, and since we know that Mom is upset, which is not I'll end with one last question. From your infinite number now of near-death experiences, and you have not become compost pa yet. What would you say is? How about just this last one? Like, what would you say is something that you have learned or are grateful for, that you just, I know, like, in a very small version, whenever I'm sick, which hasn't been, I think I had COVID for the third time 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, and you just feel gross. And then when you feel better, you're like, ugh, all these things that I'm going to do because I feel better now, right? And I know you never, like you said, you haven't been able to run in 19 years, almost 20 years. And that's a source of frustration for you. But
that's
when
true.
you come back, isn't that crazy? And not that to my own sob story, but this lung issue, I get so tired after just a couple miles. I can't breathe and get oxygenated. But what would you say is something that you take away and are just like simple things that you're grateful for that you couldn't do in the ICU, or just the lack of pain, or I genuinely don't know, because you've been through so much physically and mentally, emotionally, all the things.
Well, the fact of being able to move in the direction you want to go instead of where an IV or an art line or whatever is limiting you, and you have to take it, and you have to take it, and you have to take it day after day. And the coldest summer I ever spent was in the ICU down in Texas, in Houston, with 102-degree outside temperature. It was 70 inside, and with a flimsy one layer of cotton between me and the air conditioner, I was freezing for a month.
I know, I'm so sorry.
And to get in a different, more comfortable position. So just the fact and that you can wiggle your toes, it's wonderful. And so that sounds ridiculous, but it's the reality that we are blessed every day with abilities that we don't really realize until we lose them.
Yeah.
Or temporarily, fortunately, versus permanently. And people that have not been careful and thoughtful of their own body have ended up quadriplegics, which was where you're totally incapacitated except your head and neck, and maybe your shoulders can shrug.
Yeah.
And that doesn't come back. That's not been able to be demonstrated with all their attempts, which is laudable. That movement is one of the only parts of our body that everybody has options on. That you can grab something or you can not grab it. You can steal something or you can leave it on the shelf. Whereas your heart, you really can't determine, except if you're a yoga or whatever it is that they, or whatever they're called, that develop such a yogi, that develop such a discipline that they can lower and raise their heartbeat. But that takes a lot of time and attention, and I'd rather go out for a run and then go off to work than to sit there and try and slow my heart rate down. Anyhow, we are blessed. If you want to come up with a single ethic, is just being thankful. Every day is a blessing, and that we have a choice to make, and the way that we can manifest it is through our musculoskeletal system. Yeah. We go to work or we stay home. We go for a run or we sit and lament, and so.
Yeah, no, that's something I've of course taught Patrick, my son, since he was born, is that we each of us, which is kind of part of my book too, each of us only really has 3 things on this earth that are ever really ours. And I always make Patrick, I'm always curious, like, do people know it? But it's your body, and your mind and your spirit. And that's all, like, the thoughts you think, the things you choose to do, right?
Yep.
And I feel like all of them, to me, that's the Trinity, but that's a whole different conversation. There's multiple Trinities that you could think of in terms of, but that you are, I mean, so much of who you are is based on what you do. Like you said, you can choose to go for a run or you can choose to sit there. And I don't say that with an ethical judgment on it right now for myself, because I always was very able-bodied, and now I'm dealing with the lung condition, or like you had, and now you can't run anymore. Like, I recognize that there are challenges that people have, but do you still get out there and try to do right by these parts of yourself?
Well, and the ethics that can speak to is that of respecting yourself and your body. And my son listened to me when I told him, don't jump into the water until you know what's at the bottom and how close it is to the surface. And he jumped off a 40-foot cliff. Oof. And he had checked first, swimming around looking underneath to make sure there wasn't a rock. This is up in the boundary waters. And I had checked around the place that we have up on the Lake Superior that has rocks just under the surface.
Yeah, you got to do a deep dive.
There's only one spot that you can dive in safely. And if not, you hit your head and you are
you're dead.
Quadriplegic.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I, for years up at Tetigooch in Lake Superior, people have never been to Lake Superior, it's worth the trip. It's worth the bucket list. Wherever you are in the world, Lake Superior is worth showing up for.
And the Boundary Waters.
Yes, and the Boundary Waters. But so I once took kids, and we were going cliff diving at a place called Gooseberry Falls. into the water, and I did deep dives, and I made sure and the water was at least 10 feet deep. I mean, I couldn't get down and touch the rocks below, but it was, again, a very specific spot. And then I will say, when Ben, my ex-husband, he was telling, when I met him, he was talking about going cliff jumping in California and filming it for a short film with he and his college buddies. And they didn't check the depth. And he would laugh about it, but I was always like, you could have broken your back. He said he jumped in. It was about a 25-foot cliff into like 4 feet of water. And I was like, oh my God, like even thinking about it, because he has had back issues. And I'm not even joking. I go back to that. I'm like, you may have effed up your back. And
oh, sure.
Yeah. And because like this is a whole nother topic, and I know we have to wrap it up, but that a lot of young men, they don't want to seem weak in front of each other. That I'm sure he had his friends there. They were filming. He didn't want to be the one causing a problem. That like, you guys didn't check this. You filmed me. You said, it was safe. And then I, hurt myself quite badly, but I'm not going to, admit it. So I'm just going to laugh it off, and I, that's a whole topic of men and women and young people. And
ethic.
It is. And when do you stand up for yourself? And when do you... these are challenges that people face.
You can be a brilliant-minded person, but you have one stupid moment.
Yes.
That carries the rest of your life. And there was somebody on one of the news channels, Fox actually, that was a medical student at the time that jumped into water without checking it, and he became an instant paraplegic.
Yeah.
And ended up having to change his career, and just the resilience of his response to that terrible, stupid act was a career that led him on a path he never wanted to go. It's hard to be a surgeon if you're quadriplegic, and
surgeons are essentially athletes. They just to be able to endure
the time that I...
Yeah, one of your surgeries took how long? 14 hours?
13 hours on the pump, which means that your heart is stopped and it's open and it's not beating, and your lungs are bypassed for the most part. Actually, they are, because the lungs are wrapped around the heart, and you can't operate on the heart when the lungs keep getting in the way every second or every 10 seconds. So it leaves a wound that's hard to define, that you can live with the rest of your life, or it takes years to recover. I'm still recovering.
That stuff like that, and then I'll say this, and then we can be done. Is that I, people face different fears all the time, and sometimes I'm like, I've done these things with Patrick, but I'm starting to build an audience. We've got our 1 million people that we're speaking. Yeah, we're going for it right now, Dad. Yeah, billion. Yeah, billion. That was how much I tried to sell that couch for in 1981. $1 billion. I spelled it. Four. That's right. It was 4.
Yeah, it was a little love seat.
I was trying to get in the way of my parents moving us out of my favorite neighborhood, and I thought if I made the couch at the estate sale way too expensive. We should have listened to me. Yes. I thought that would stop them. That was my logic. That can you imagine? So you talk about facing fears, right? These are just simple social fears. Sometimes I'm like, I have this pseudo public persona in my world as elected, and then I've got this pseudo public persona if people see these videos, and sometimes they clash, and who might use this and pull. Your brain gets a little overwhelmed of like fear, right? Oh, what happened here, and you're triaging your fear. But then when I sit down and I think, well, come on, that is just ridiculous. There's literally a person, I don't know who it is, but other people, not a lot on the planet, but who will have someone's life literally in their hands, with their chest cracked and their heart beating in front of you for 12 hours, and to not lose focus and to stay on track. Your surgeons, sometimes I just can't even conceive of what they've been able to do. And I know you want like confidentiality, but your catastrophic aneurysm from 9 years ago, I think of that surgeon. You came in having, passed out, essentially legally dead for 11 minutes or whatever it was. where you didn't have energy to your heart. Is that mine? No, that's you. Is this me?
Is it? It's you.
It's me. It's an alarm. I had an alarm. That must have been
That's alarming.
That must have been my don't accidentally sleep past 9 alarm, but don't worry, my dad knocked on my door. We've had a couple of guests, but what surgeons are able to do and the fear that they would face, and that's the way I would think of it. I think there's a level, you get this is a whole. We've had so many things in new conversations. That's where I think a lot of MDs get a God complex because you have been able to bring someone back from the brink. Yeah. But I also want to respect. It's a fine line. So. Anyway, mad respect to all of your surgeons and then the people last week who flat out said when I was in the room with you, "You're an enigma, Dr. Thompson," and you are.
Well, I'm blessed greatly by family and friends and the Creator that made me as I am. So there's one, every conversation leads to another thought.
I know. I'm sorry. And then we turn into Grandma Ruth. But
exactly.
I'll let you have the last word, Dad, and then I'll have to cut us off.
Because there are, that life is a continuum, and it's an incredible continuum in the relationships that develop. That with my mother, I had the relationship that she could talk for an hour, and she would leave something in the first minute,
and she would
go off on a tangent and come back an hour later and link right into it and finish it off. Mm-hmm. And she was bright, and she knew it, and she said it, and she was valedictorian. Yes. And so she was not squeamish in recognition of the blessing that she had received for her life. But unfortunately, with all of us, if we think too highly of ourselves, we can get into trouble, just as that medical student that dove in and hit the rock or hit the bottom of whatever body of water he was on at the time. And so great wisdom is to realize that we're not smart in everything. And we have we have to respect our bodies and check a few things out. To double dare or triple dare or whatever is on the track to stupidity and paralysis. Well,
definitely mind over body in that regard, and body over mind in the sense of that. I talk about that in my book too, about emotions and how we use those kind of social things to put us into bad situations. But on that note, thank you for dropping popping, Dad.
Okay, and this is
I hope it all got recorded properly.
Pre-compost pod.
Yeah, we'll do another one. We'll do another one of these sooner than later. I'll bring the whole rig over to your house.
Oh dear.
It's a very simple. It's incredible though. Like I said, it's incredible what technology has been able to do for us in the last years. Sidebar. See, we could go forever. My grandfather, your father, always wanted a radio program, and he tried to do it, and he spent all this money on massive radio equipment, and now I literally can order things from Amazon, and it gets me overnight, and it's the whole setup. Or TikTok shop. Okay, thank you so much, Dad.
Right.
Off we go. I'm going to turn us off.
All of you,
yes, absolutely. We'll probably do this in 2 parts.
Have an intimate conversation.
Yes, thank you for being here. And off. Did I turn it off? Thank you so much for listening to Zeros and Ones with Becca Thompson. Please subscribe and share.